Welcome to The Middle. I'm Jeremy Hobson, along with our house DJ, Tolliver, who is actually a DJ on the radio version of this show, but not on the podcast because we don't have the rights to play the music on the podcast. And so I feel like I have to occasionally remind listeners of that, Tolliver, in case they're wondering what it is that you do here.
I told you I'll make a brand new soundtrack for The Middle. Okay, don't play with me. I'll come in hot.
Then we would have the rights. Okay,
exactly.
So this hour we are jumping into the deep end with a topic that can be tricky to talk about, and that is DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. It has been almost 5 years to the day since the murder of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer, an event that shocked the world and led to widespread protests about racial justice and reckoning in America. On an institutional level, one of the biggest efforts we saw to acknowledge this was the implementation of DEI measures across all levels of business, education, and government. And while these efforts were designed with racial healing in mind, they became divisive for some, with DEI effectively turning into a dirty word for some Americans. One of President Trump's first executive orders banned it from federal programs and policies, and the president has pressured private companies to do the same, and many of them have. So our question is, if not DEI, then what can be done to reckon with injustices of the past and ensure equal opportunity for all Americans? We're taking your calls in a moment at 844-4-MIDDLE. That is 844-464-3353. So now to our question this hour, if not DEI, then what? Tolliver, the phone number, please.
It's 844-4-MIDDLE. That's 844-464-3353. Or you can write to us at listentothemiddle.com. You can also comment on our live stream on YouTube. I'm checking them all, okay? So hit me up. I'll get you on the air.
All right. Joining us this hour, ACLU President Deborah Archer, author of the new book, Dividing Lines, How Transportation Infrastructure Reinforces Racial. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
And Kmele Foster is with us as well, editor-at-large at Tangle News, an independent, nonpartisan news outlet. He's also a board member at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Kmele, welcome to you.
Wonderful to be with you. Thanks so much for the invitation.
So before we get to the phones, Deborah Archer, your new book explores just one aspect of the infrastructure, you could say, that has made our country unequal. That would be transportation. You write, the nation's transportation system is a material manifestation of the structural racial inequalities built into the foundations of this country. Explain what you mean by that.
Yeah. I think transportation in America is a bit of a paradox. We often think of roads and highways and public transit as symbols of progress and connection, and they absolutely are. But the story that I tell in Dividing Lines is about how these same systems have also been used as tools of exclusion and displacement, especially in Black communities. So transportation and movement have long been tools for enforcing white supremacy. And then as legal segregation began to crumble during the civil rights movement, cities across America started turning to infrastructure. And in many ways, infrastructure replaced Jim Crow. So highways were deliberately routed through Black neighborhoods. City planners used things like one-way streets and dead ends to physically and socially and economically isolate Black communities. And then we also know how public transportation evolved under a cloud of racism, first with explicit discrimination and then more subtle dog whistle policies.
Like public transportation not going into certain neighborhoods because, let's say, the white people don't want the people of color coming in from those places into the center of the city.
Yeah, the result of the discrimination in public transportation is something that we often refer to as transportation deserts. In Black communities, that means they don't have access to regular public transportation, and that's from disinvestment, but also transportation deserts in many white communities by design to keep Black people and other people of color out, often under the guise of safety, right? Kind of leaning into narratives of excessive Black criminality.
So given all of your work on this book, what do you think when you see the backlash to the DEI initiatives that grew after the murder of George Floyd and the president banning DEI from the federal government and pressuring companies and institutions to do the same?
Yeah, so ultimately, the book is about how racism adapts, right? Racism, part of its power is that it's creative, that it's evolving, that it finds its way into all the spaces Right? In dividing lines, it's how racism found its way into zoning boards and city planning departments. But we see this narrative repeat all around the country, the way that racism that we experienced post-slavery and in the 50s and in the 70s, it's still with us. It has just evolved. It has changed shapes and uses different policies and tools. And bans on diversity, equity, and inclusion and related measures means that we can address the ways that we continue to be impacted by racism and inequality.
Kmele Foster, you have a slightly different perspective. You were critical of DEI initiatives early on. You've said the companies and people behind them may have had noble intentions, but that they may have gone too far.
Yeah, definitely say that's true. I think in general, I appreciate many of the historic things that Deborah has outlined in her opening remarks. But I think the public debate around DEI has been dominated by a lot of euphemism and caricature. I think a lot of advocates often present it as this kind of very obvious, straightforward, morally unassailable set of ideas. And they will often paint critics as these folks who are indifferent to injustice or motivated by white supremacy or ignorant of history. But I think the reality is that DEI does represent a kind of significant philosophical shift from a position of kind of individual equality that virtually all Americans agree on pretty violently, and individual equality under the law in particular, to something like group-based analysis and redistribution on the basis of kind of equity with respect to outcomes for particular groups that are generally regarded as disadvantaged. And this shift is not a minor policy tweak. This is a real kind of transformational sort of innovation. And I think the important thing to acknowledge is that these programs, and whether we're talking about DEI or critical race theory or racial justice, we're often redefining fairness in a way that makes a lot of people deeply uncomfortable. And the people who it makes uncomfortable aren't just white people. They're often people who, like me, and quite frankly, like Deborah. And I think it's interesting that you've got two civil libertarians talking about these issues, that many of us are deeply concerned about any sort of policy approach that is going to fundamentally treat people not as individuals who are equal under the law, that's equality, but as members of racial groups, that it will privilege some sort of class distinction and then actually have the law or even the bureaucratic machinery of large organizations, be they campuses or corporations, prioritize people or deprioritize them on the basis of race. And we have seen these programs essentially go awry in precisely that way.
So, Kmele, what do you think then when you see so many DEI initiatives being thrown out the window and people like the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, saying anyone trying to do DEI at the Pentagon will be out?
Well, I think the caricatures exist on both on the right and the left with respect to these issues, both among proponents and critics, to be more specific. I think it's also important to roll the clock back a little bit. As I said, this is not just a kind of this is what fairness and justice looks like. There has been a kind of sea change philosophically and ideologically. And the Biden administration, when they first arrived into power in 2020, they actually instituted a raft of executive orders that tried to inculcate DEI into various aspects of the federal government. And for a very long time, corporations and universities were embracing these policies. And about 5 years ago, as we all know, the quote unquote racial reckoning occurred. And at that point, there was a profound interest in trying to prioritize racial equity. So it's important to recognize that we're not just seeing the Trump administration roll something back that we all agreed on before that was noble and good. It's the Trump administration responding to something that began on the left with people instituting these policies and now rolling them back. And I think both sides, quite frankly, would benefit from prioritizing pluralism, where we can have meaningful disagreements and robust conversations about the role of equality and equity in the law and under the law, quite frankly, without demonizing one another and talking past one another. I think we can have sober, serious conversations about justice, about fairness, and about what the law ought to prioritize, and even the efficacy and effectiveness of DEI policies without caricatures. And I look forward to having that conversation today. I know Deborah is up to the task.
Well, and I would ask Deborah for a response right now, but I'm not going to do that because I only have about 15 seconds to get one. So we'll get it right after this
Sorry.
break.
Talked a little too much.
Well, that wouldn't be fair if I stopped her 15 seconds in. But anyway, our number is 844-4MIDDLE. That's 844-464-3353. And Tolliver, it is interesting, given what's happening now, to listen back to the discourse right after the murder of George Floyd in 2020.
Yeah, back then even Republicans were in favor of some of the DEI initiatives that were coming out, including, shocker, Senator Mitch McConnell.
You can understand the outrage. I mean, what happened? This is a vexing issue. If we could have figured out exactly what to do, I think we'd have done it years ago. It's one of our continuing, persistent problems in our society that we're all acutely aware of and searching for answers.
Shocking.
A reminder, Mitch McConnell is retiring next year, ending a 40-year career in Congress. Ooh. Tolliver, as we go into this break and wait to hear from Deborah Archer right afterwards, what are we listening to here?
This is Aretha Franklin's version of A Change Is Gonna Come. We all love Sam Cooke, but, Aretha's the queen of soul, so I had to shout her out. More of The Middle coming up after the break.
This is The Middle. I'm Jeremy Hobson. If you're just tuning in, The Middle is a national call-in show. We're focused on elevating voices from the middle, geographically, politically, and philosophically, or maybe you just want to meet in the middle. This hour, we're asking, if not DEI, then what can be done to reckon with the past and ensure equal opportunity for all Americans? Tolliver, the phone number again, please.
It's 844-4MIDDLE. That's 844-464-3353. You can also write to us at listentothemiddle.com or on social media, and some of you already have, and it's scandalous. Okay.
Well, and if you are calling in, and by the way, if you're hitting a busy signal, because I see the lines are all full right now, you can leave a message for us. I'm joined by ACLU President Deborah Archer, author of the book Dividing Lines, and Tangle News editor-at-large Kmele Foster. And before we go back to the phones, Deborah Archer, let's get your thoughts on what we just heard there. And I guess I'll also ask sort of, how does the ACLU navigate this? Because you could say you have people saying that you need DEI initiatives to reduce discrimination, and you could also say have people saying DEI is discriminatory.
Yeah, I think there's so much that Kmele said that we really need to break down and engage in conversation. One point is that I don't think that DEI and racial justice efforts are about redefining equality. I think a lot of them are about redefining merit, and that makes people uncomfortable. So a lot of what we define as merit actually are factors that consolidate and amplify access to privilege that has historically and continues to be denied disproportionately to people of color. So, for example, we have college admissions programs that require calculus. And study after study has shown that predominantly Black and Latinx schools don't have access to calculus. And therefore, it makes that harder for them to get admissions. And so we need to challenge this idea that our system before was based on merit and that we're doing something else. And I think in many ways, it's about redefining merit. Also, when we talk about what DEI is not just affirmative action. It is not just hiring processes. DEI is what led us to have family and maternity leave. It is not just about dealing with the inequalities at the back end. It is about prevention. It is about trainings that help us understand where there are inequalities built into our system. Again, systems that we thought were merit-based, but really amplify differential access. And no one's saying that there aren't challenges or problems with racial justice efforts or diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. But it doesn't mean that we throw everything out, right? We have a criminal legal system that is rife with racial inequality, and we don't just toss the whole system out. Instead, we try to get at the problem areas. And so I'm not beyond having a conversation about some of the ways in which diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts might have resulted in unfairness or inequity. But that's the conversation we need to have. And that's not the conversation we're having. It's not what we're seeing. We're seeing a wholesale removal of the ability to talk about race, to address racial inequality, and erasure of people of color. And then finally, the challenge for me is the insistence on the other end of colorblindness, and an insistence on colorblindness does real damage in a world that's shaped by race. Ignoring race doesn't make racism go away. Race continues to matter. It continues to constrain the opportunities of some and expand the opportunities for others. So at the ACLU, we are fighting to make sure that everyone has equal access to opportunity. And so for us, tearing down some of the real barriers that we see that prevent access to educational opportunity and economic opportunity and good health, strong communities. That's
Right.
what we're fighting for.
Well, okay. Let me say. You say don't want to throw everything out. It certainly does seem like that is exactly what the Trump administration is doing right now. And Kmele Foster, let me ask you briefly because I do want to get to some of these callers as well. Is there a replacement for DEI initiatives that you think would be more useful?
Well, I want to just clarify something here, and I think it's pretty important. I, for one, am not a proponent of colorblindness. Quite frankly, I'm an individualist, which I think is fundamentally different. I'm for something. What I am opposed to is a kind of racial primacy with respect to our analysis and attempts to understand a really complicated multivariate world. I love the example that Deborah provided a moment ago of kind of calculus programs and access to them being something that is absolutely essential to being able to attain a higher education and succeed in various fields. It does seem to me that there is a real question about the efficacy of prioritizing kind of racial disparities versus prioritizing access to the actual programs that are likely to get one the kind of advantages that we'd all like to see conferred upon every student. And from my standpoint, when I see a child is either going to be enrolled in a program in Appalachia or in Baltimore City, I know that those students might look different from one another, but the deprivation that they're going to suffer is identical. And I think the rather subtle implication of the social justice kind of DEI worldview, and I hate to even use the word because it's so confusing at this point, is that there is a suggestion that I ought to be disproportionately concerned about someone in a particular circumstance on the basis of their race. And I'm just not. I am far more concerned with actual deprivation in individual people's lives than I am racial disparities. I think if we obsess over disparities, we run the risk of living in a Harrison Bergeron type world where success can be defined as either raising the ceiling for everyone or lowering it on everyone. And that can't be what we actually want. Racial parity is not my goal. My goal is a free and prosperous society. And I think we only get there by prioritizing individualism and human dignity as the basis for individualism as the basis for human dignity. That has always been the prize. And I think the mistake that's been made by many, many well-intentioned people is to confuse this project of trying to adjudicate these past harms on the basis of racial lines, that they don't appreciate that there are inherent disadvantages that are associated with that, like the reification of these racial categories, which I think, quite frankly, the last 5 years tell us pretty clearly that an emphasis on race here, the capitalization of B in Black, for example, may actually be driving us apart and concretizing these racial identities as opposed to helping us identify what we have in common most fundamentally.
I want to stop you there. I think we've actually set a record now for the longest period without getting to any callers. And we could just go back and forth between the two of you for the entire show, but I do want to get to some callers. Let's get to Candace in Salt Lake City, Utah. Candace, go ahead with your thoughts.
Hello, I am a femme, gender, queer tenured professor at the University of Michigan, pronouns they, them, and I have benefited from diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And as many of you know, the University of Michigan recently dismantled DEI initiatives across all 3 Michigan campuses. Faculty, staff, and students are furious about this decision. The question is, what do we do instead of DEI? And I have to call upon Black feminist scholarship for this, and Ruha Benjamin's Imagination, a Manifesto, and Benjamin is really not a proponent of DEI within institutions, and she sees it as a placeholder. Really what she believes is we should focus on hyper-local organizing. So that could include creating imagination collectives dedicated to generating and implementing alternative futures. And I think systems and institutions could do this too, or freedom laboratories, which are spaces to experiment with new social arrangements, technologies, where communities can try out alternatives to current systems. So I guess bottom line, DEI didn't go far enough.
Interesting perspective. Candace, thank you very much for that. Let me get another one in here. And Gabe, who's in Charleston, South Carolina. Gabe, your thoughts?
Hi, thank you for having me. Yeah, I go to the college, or I shouldn't say, but I'm in college, and they also dismantled like all the DEI initiatives. I'm an education major, and one of the it's not like this thing called Call Me Mister and the Sisters of Septima are two fellowships for like Black educators, and they essentially got their funding cut. And also, like the previous caller said, like we had a Pride Center, we had this multicultural center. Those are completely eradicated. Not really. I mean, I think the legislation was so vague that the board of trustees kind of like just decided to cut it. You know. So,
well, Gabe, do you have a better solution than DEI then, if it's been cut where you are?
A better solution? I can't really think of like a better solution. I don't really think of the harm that's being done either. I say just reinstate it.
Reinstate it. Okay, interesting. Deborah Archer, what do you think about that? Two people who say it didn't go far enough, and reinstate it where they are, where it's been cut.
I appreciate that because I think it recognizes that without we saw a lot of progress on racial inclusion. And that was because of a lot of these efforts that we had, not about giving people access to spaces and opportunities that they didn't deserve. It was about making sure that we were taking down unnecessary barriers. And without the DEI efforts, I think people in institutions at colleges and universities and companies are seeing the division come back, where we are going to resegregate in many ways. And so it cannot be that we have no tools. And so I appreciate the folks that say it didn't go far enough, focusing on other ways that we build power, we create access. I don't disagree with Kmele that we need to make sure that everyone has access. But racism is a real thing that helps to continually find its way into all of the solutions and reinforce these inequalities. So yes, let's make sure that children have access to educational opportunities. All children, we fight for all children, not just my children. I want to fight for everyone's children. But somehow in that fight, we still end up in places where there is deep racial inequalities. And either we're going to end up in a place where we think there's something wrong with Black children and Black families. They don't value education. They don't believe in taking advantage of economic opportunity, or we have to recognize there are deep, deep problems within our systems, not historical ones, but current ones as well. And so whatever we do, it cannot be to turn our backs on racial justice efforts. And so I appreciate that sentiment in both of the callers.
Let's get to Ryan, who's in Pittsburgh. Ryan, welcome to the middle. Go ahead with your thoughts.
Hey, thank you for having me this evening. I'm a former educator of 12 years in Chicago Public Schools. I now work at the University of Pittsburgh. I really wish, in looking back at DEI, there had been a more explicit focus on socioeconomic issues. And when we talk about diversity, people that don't have college educations or people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, I really felt like the socioeconomic messaging that was there in DEI was not forefront. And, in looking back at like Martin Luther King's last moments, his Poor People's Campaign, he really emphasized there's no going after racism and sexism and other issues without that economic issue. And if there's an DEI 2.0, I really hope that at the forefront, we see that socioeconomic message of social justice. Thank you so much. Thank you,
Ryan. Kmele.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things I'd like to say. First, the caller from Michigan, it's very ironic that is the particular program that was referred to, because the New York Times, Nicholas Confessori, wrote a pretty extensive and devastating piece back in October of last year about Michigan's efforts in DEI. and underscored the fact that the spending was pretty profound, that they doubled down on the program, and that their enrollment did not budge in terms of Black student enrollment. It stayed at about 6.1%, despite the fact that they doubled the spending. About 56% of the spending actually ended up going into salaries and benefits for the staff who are working on these programs. And it's really important to underscore this, that these programs are not just of kind of mixed quality. Many of them fail in really profound ways. We see so many stories about these anti-racism centers that are going out of business in various ways. And the reality is there's a question that has to be asked, which actually mirrors what the last caller was just referring to here. Are these programs generally benefiting the most needy? Are they actually serving the interests of the people who most need help? Or are they helping people who are already going to be going to pretty good universities, perhaps go to better universities, who are already in the C-suite, get a slightly better job? And are they helping people essentially get really great, high-paying jobs in the industry that is supposed to be delivering greater diversity and not so much serving the interests of the people in those programs? And quite frankly, I think there's a lot of evidence that calls into question the quality of these programs. So simply doubling down on it would be a profound error in my estimation. And it would probably be an error that is motivated by attention to the stated goal and purpose of these programs, not attention to whether or not they're actually working.
Tolliver, some comments coming in online.
Yeah, so McDuffie from Georgia, shout out to McDuffie, listens every week, says when your only option is accept DEI or get canceled, what do you think the result is going to be? The case for any kind of diversity programming needs to be presented much differently to get meaningful acceptance. And then Candy in Dallas says, I'm a retired female engineer. DEI allows those who wouldn't otherwise get a chance at a position, even if they have equivalent education and experience, to have that shot. DEI programs train hiring managers to be aware of unconscious bias. I'm going to stop there so we don't go too long, but I wanted to ask our panel, because my impression of DEI was that it doesn't have anything to do with quotas, but just expanding the pool of applicants. And so I have trouble seeing the negative side of that. Deborah, if you wanted to.
Yeah, well, I think that's right. It warrants clarification because quotas have been illegal for quite some time. Reserving spots has been illegal since Bakke. And so we've always had that, and people should challenge programs that are engaged in using quotas, that are engaged in reserving spots, and all of those things. And so DEI, again, is far more expansive and inclusive than we make it out to be. Talking about enrollment is often the focus, or hiring is often the focus. But I think spending some funds for DEI programs on staff is important because it's not just about the diversity, it's about the equity and the inclusion. And at the institutions that I've been in, a lot of the DEI staff and folks who focus on that are about making sure that once students are there, once folks are inside that institution, that we are making sure that they are supported. So I think that that is an important aspect. And the socioeconomic issues, I'm so glad that Ryan raised that because it is important. It is a challenge. For my parents are immigrants to this community. I'm the first generation American citizen, first person in my family to graduate from college. And those efforts to support folks from different socioeconomic backgrounds helped me get to where I am today. And we're losing those as well.
Well, Tolliver, we heard from Mitch McConnell earlier, but we ultimately saw a lot of backlash to DEI, even from politicians on the left.
Yeah, former Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg among them. Here he is speaking back in February.
We believe in the values that we care about for a reason, and this is not about abandoning those values. And what do we mean when we talk about diversity? Is it caring for people's different experiences and making sure no one's mistreated because of them, which I will always fight for? Or is it making people sit through a training that looks like something out of Portlandia, which I have also experienced, and it is how Trump Republicans are made, if that comes to your workplace with the best of intentions. Actually, if we thought about it a little bit differently, things like diversity would be actually an example of how we reach out beyond our traditional coalition.
It's interesting to see a lot of Democrats who are clearly running for president move to the right rather than to the left in the pre-primary stage. Tolliver, what are we listening to here?
This is Sly and the Family Stone with Everyday People. If there was like a diversity national anthem, it's got to be this song, all right? So more of your calls coming up on The Middle.
This is The Middle. I'm Jeremy Hobson. In this hour, we're asking you, if not DEI, then what? You can call us at 844-4MIDDLE. That's 844-464-3353. Or you can reach out at listentothemiddle.com. My guests are Tangle News editor-at-large Kmele Foster and ACLU President Deborah Archer. Her new book is called Dividing Lines. The phone lines are full. Let's get to Joseph in St. Louis, Missouri. Joseph, welcome to The Middle. What do you think?
Good evening. I think that the best way to ensure equality of opportunity is to ensure equality of opportunity. I mean, given that we live in a diverse society, given that identities are important to people, we should really strive to kind of, especially in the context of employment contracts or government policy, like how orchestras do blind auditions, where race, sex, age doesn't matter. And, you know, that's not to say that race doesn't matter in life, but just in these legally binding contractual obligations that we all enter into. And we really need to get rid of the disparate impact theory, which is just so silly on its face that we're gnashing our teeth and pulling our hair that there aren't enough Guatemalans in the NBA, or that there's not enough women coders, or too many black children are suspended from school, or not enough.
So Joseph, let me ask you this. Clearly, you're not a fan of the DEI efforts that existed before. Did it factor into your vote in the last election? Did you vote for Trump?
I did. And yeah, I mean, I like one like the Buttigieg comment that you said, where it's like a Portlandia sketch. I've had to sit through some of these struggle sessions that the irony is they make people really, as one of your guests says, concretize their identities as separate from each other. And it makes the people who didn't get the job, even if they didn't deserve it, feel resentful that they didn't get it. And then the people who did get the job are looked at as, oh, you're just a DEI affirmative action hire. So, I mean, in a diverse society like this, we really need to struggle to just kind of individual merit.
Okay, Joseph, thank you very much. Kmele Foster, I'm glad we got a call like that, because it is representative, obviously, of people who voted on this issue for Donald Trump.
Yeah, I'd say that's right, and I think it's just imperative to acknowledge the various ways, and perhaps to find some specific examples of where these programs run afoul of a lot of people's just deeply inborn sensibilities about what fairness looks like. And it is important to acknowledge that those blind auditions, for example, have been criticized on the grounds that they don't take into consideration racial equity, that what some people would prefer to see is something akin to quota systems. And it's important to acknowledge that a lot of the consternation currently aimed at Harvard, not from the administration, who I think has made any number of profound errors and is kind of running afoul of various civil liberty principles that are very important to me, that there are various ways in which schemes have been implemented in order to try and limit the number of Asian students who are being enrolled in schools because they are overrepresented, quote unquote, with respect to their share of the demographic population. And I just think that that's wrong. A person should not be penalized for their individual success on account of happening to belong to the wrong racial group. There's too many of you people here is not the sort of sentiment that anyone should be promoting. And if it, I know that it sounds perhaps a bit crass to put it that way, but that literally is the direct impact of a policy of prioritizing people for admittance on the basis of their race, even if they're a member of an underrepresented group. So I do think that it has pernicious consequences, and we've seen that over the course of the last 5 years or so. And there is an alternative. We could simply look at a policy of trying to make our society one that is treating people on an individual basis in as much as that is a possibility. And it's hard to optimize for that if we continue to reify race and continue to double down on a kind of soft essentialism. I think it's a profound mistake. And in many instances, it's not even so soft.
Let's hear from Harry in Missouri City, Texas. Hi, Harry. Welcome to The Middle. Go ahead with your thoughts.
Well, my thoughts are I agree with Kmele Foster and Deborah Archer and some of the callers. I don't really agree with that last caller who voted for Trump. I think the Trump administration is trying to resegregate America because he came out of a segregated society. And I just think that what he's trying to do is he's just trying to say white privilege first. with this DEI issue, it's difficult. You have to work at it. If not DEI, what the question is, you're going to have to people have to put their prejudices aside, because in this society, racism is taught at a very young age, and it's very difficult for people to put that aside when people come in they want to apply for they want to go to Ivy League school, whether it's or they want to apply for a corporation, and we want equal opportunity. If they have the credentials, then their ethnic background should not matter. Because if you in a corporation or any of these schools, if you have mostly white people in it, then you're not really practicing DEI, because the people of color are being left behind, because we live in a diversity society, and you're not practicing where it is diverse in corporations and in universities if you have mostly white people in it. And I think that's what Donald Trump represents.
Yeah.
I don't think
Harry.
he is for
I think we've got it, Harry.
for all ethnic groups.
Thank you very much for that, Deborah Archer. I'll go to you for your thoughts on those calls.
Yeah. So I do want to stress that no one supports, or I certainly don't support, discrimination against Asian students. But I think thinking about how we challenge negative action, which is direct discrimination against Asian students because of their race, is different than affirmative action programs, because affirmative action programs have actually shown to support the admission of lots of folks who are Asian, who are underrepresented. And so we have to think differently about, be careful about how we have that conversation. The last caller was talking about Ivy League universities. And some of it, Kmele raised this issue about whether we're trying to get people at better colleges and universities as opposed to just getting into colleges and universities. And I think that's important too. We shouldn't have a two-tier system of higher education. We know how important it is to have access to Ivy League schools, right? The number of Supreme Court justices that came from Yale or Harvard is meaningful. And it shows to us that within our system, access to the most elite institutions is also important. We should have access to all those levels. And then I think it was Joseph who talked about getting rid of disparate impact. And I just had to speak to that, because we have to, if we want to fight racism, we have to fight racism in all its forms and its manifestations. And disparate impact is one of the ways that we get at racism, because racism today is not Bull Connor with sticking dogs on Black kids trying to go to school. It manifests in different ways. And disparate impact helps us get at that. And then finally, on the blind auditions piece, what was of interest to me in thinking and learning about those blind auditions was that at first there were many folks who did not see differences with the blind auditions on gender. They still had disproportionate numbers of men in orchestras, and it wasn't until they realized that they should carpet the floor. So you cannot hear the person walking in. And in auditions, blind auditions where there was carpeted floor, you saw more gender diversity than you did if it was uncarpeted. And people suspect it's because you could hear the clicking of high heels differently than other shoe wear. And so, it just to me shows that we have to stay vigilant, because inequality and discrimination finds its way into our systems. Yeah. And if we let down our guard, we're going to be a resegregated country on many, many levels.
You say it's not just Bull Connor. There's something in your book, Deborah Archer, that I had never even thought about before, which is your book, of course, about transportation. You write that if you get a parking violation these days, you get a ticket. If you jump a turnstile in a subway, you can get arrested. And what you say is the people that are going to jump the turnstile and get arrested are maybe more often to be people of color rather than the sort of like white collar crime of a parking ticket.
Yeah, so there have been studies that show in public transportation systems where a large percentage of the riders, majority of riders, are Black and brown folks, that we're more likely to bring the criminal legal system into that public transportation system. And so if you look at parking, violations as theft, right? You're not paying your meter. You get a ticket. You can pay it at your leisure. You can get 20 tickets and still be able to park. But if you jump a turnstile in New York City, the police are engaged. And it's different in public transportation systems where the majority of riders, the overwhelming majority of riders are white.
Let's go to Stan, who's in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Hi, Stan. Go ahead with your thoughts.
If Trump got rid of DEI, who is that supposed to help?
Stan, would you mind me asking your age?
I am 15.
15. Awesome. I love it when we get under 18. Okay, so his question, Kmele Foster, what do you think about that? Getting rid of DEI, who does that help?
Yeah, I know 2 callers ago, someone was speculating about the motivations of the Trump administration. And I think ascribing the worst possible motivations to people is probably not the best idea. I also think it's generally not the best idea to imagine that most people are motivated by the worst possible thing. In general, I suspect most of the people who are skeptical of a lot of these programs are more like me. They generally have a sense that fairness and justice under the law means that people are treated equally, irrespective of their particular background. And it's people like me who appreciate that the dimensions of difference are illimitable, which is to say that the number of ways that I could be discriminated against in any context is not limited to my race or gender or ideology. It could be virtually anything. And it's imperative that we not be so particularly consumed with racial disparities and the notion of race or gender or even sexuality that we can't see that maybe the correlation between arrests and fair beating might have something to do with the fact that there is more likely to be criminality of various other sorts that's associated with fair beating that is happening en masse. Whereas when we're talking about a proliferation of parking tickets, you're not necessarily going to see the same dynamic. It certainly could be the case that race is driving these things. It's also the case that the dynamics are far more complicated, as they usually are. So who does this help to get rid of these programs? It could help any number of people who might be unfairly disadvantaged on account of their birth. If you happen to be white and you grew up in a household with a single parent, and perhaps that single parent abused you sexually or something else horrible, it doesn't matter that you're white. You didn't have the sort of privileged upbringing that I did. 2 parents who loved me profoundly and gave me every advantage, and imagining that you can tell me a great deal about people's history and their life circumstances simply by looking at the color of their skin is not just wrong, it is profoundly un-American. And I think that we have unfortunately drifted to a place with the best of intentions where we are more likely to do that sort of generalizing and essentialist casting of people. And we're doing it with the best of intentions, but I think it is to our disadvantage. If we're not seeing one another as individuals, I think it is fundamentally true that we are failing to really see one another at all.
Let's go to Tony, who's in Durham, North Carolina. Hi, Tony. Welcome to The Middle.
How are we doing tonight?
Good. Go ahead with your thoughts.
Okay. First and foremost, benign neglect has been going on in the black community, and we received it from both Democratic and Republican Party. It's funny to me how we're talking about DEI and how it's supposed to address the racial reckoning for George Floyd, but every group that you could think of attached themselves to this. We got an Asian hate crime bill. I didn't see an Asian person getting killed. Jewish community is already protected, and I don't have any bias against them, but our history is also documented. It's just not documented on film, as you guys so eloquently state about this issue. What I want to know is why we can't get any real perspective from true people who are indulged in our black community, like Neely Fuller Jr. and Claude Anderson. Stop promoting athletes and entertainers to represent us. We do have intellect in our community. And with that, I would like to hear your insight on
it. Deborah Archer, do you want to respond to Tony?
Yes. So I think, as Kmele said, dynamics are complicated. Dynamics around transportation infrastructure, dynamics around admissions to colleges and universities, dynamics around how we have created inequality within our communities. And if you erase the possibility that race is a factor, we can't actually have an honest conversation about where we are and how we got there. We'll never really solve the problem, because even in complicated dynamics, race can be a factor, and erasing that from the discussion means we're not really wrestling with everything, right? So people will say, well, we built the highway because of X, Y, and Z, and these are the things we think about when we build transportation infrastructure. And you may have thought about that too, but there's a documented history that you also said you wanted to use it to destroy a Black community, to remove a Black community, to lock in segregation physically and not just through policy. And unless that's part of the conversation about how we create inequality, about how so many Black communities were walled off from opportunity, physically, psychologically, economically, then we're not really wrestling with the problem. We're not going to build back better for everyone and for every community. And so I appreciate Tony's comments about how Black communities have been neglected and targeted. And I hope that we can have real conversations about how those communities got that way. It'll involve lots of factors, and one of those factors is racism.
Yeah, I only have about 30 seconds left, and I'm sorry to do this to you, Kmele, but I have to ask Deborah Archer, because she is the president of the ACLU. You guys have filed 53 lawsuits against the Trump administration just in the first 100 days.
Yes.
Which one do you think poses the biggest threat to Americans? What are you most concerned about right now, just briefly?
Yeah, I'm concerned about the way that we see this administration undermining the foundation of our democracy, all of the checks and balances within our system, all the ways that we hold power accountable are being undermined by this administration. That includes attacks on the legal system and the rule of law, attacks on judges, and dismantling of due process, and really weaponizing the First Amendment.
Yeah. That is ACLU President and author of the new book, Dividing Lines, Deborah Archer. And we've also been speaking with Kmele Foster, editor-at-large at the nonpartisan news outlet Tangle. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us.
Thank you for the conversation.
And don't forget, The Middle is available as a podcast in partnership with iHeart Podcasts on the iHeart app, wherever you listen to podcasts. And coming to your feed in the next few days, an episode of our weekly podcast extra, One Thing Trump Did. We're going to be looking this week at attacks on public media, very close to home. And next week, we'll be right back here asking if a college education is worth the ever-rising cost.
As always, you can call in at 8444-MIDDLE. That's 844-464-3353. Or you can reach out at listentothemiddle.com, where you can also sign up for our free weekly newsletter and support us with a tax-deductible donation.
The Middle is brought to you by Long Nook Media, distributed by Illinois Public Media in Urbana, Illinois, and produced by Harrison Patino, Danny Alexander, Sam Burmistaz, John Barth, Annika Deschler, and Brandon Kondritz. We say goodbye this week to our technical director, Jason Croft. Thank you, Jason, for working late for us and helping us get this show off the ground every week. So much can go wrong in a live radio show, and it has been so smooth, people don't even realize it's live sometimes. Thanks to our satellite radio listeners, our podcast audience, and the more than 430 public radio stations that are making it possible for people across the country to listen to The Middle. I'm Jeremy Hobson, and I will talk to you next week.